Strong Enough merch is now available. Go to strongenoughpod.com and check out all the stuff that you can get so that you'll have those daily reminders that you are strong enough, you are worth it. Welcome to the Strong Enough Podcast, where we talk about the challenges and celebrate the triumphs of people just like you. I'm your host, Claudia. Today's guest is going to talk about imposter syndrome, self-sabotage, and perfectionism. She's going to share why we find ourselves battling these things and what we can do to ditch them and move on to more productive, happier habits. Please help me welcome Kamini Wood. Kamini, how are you today?
I am well. How are you?
I am well, and for those that cannot see you today, you are just a ray of sunshine. I absolutely love it.
Thank you so much for saying that. I'm going to take that in.
You should, because you just look amazing. You have a bright, beautiful smile. So that's a great thing to start the day with.
Thank you. I try. There are some mornings where it doesn't happen, but today was one of those days because I got to talk to you.
Well, now I feel very lucky. So that we can jump in and the audience can be as excited as we are, I would love it if you would tell them a little about yourself.
Sure. So personally, I am the mom to 5. My oldest is a 21-year-old professional ballerina. I have a 19-year-old son who is in college. 16-year-old daughter, 13-year-old son, and 9-year-old daughter. So from a personal standpoint, life's pretty busy. Professionally, I am a coach that works with individuals on helping them understand what might be keeping them stuck. I work with individuals on self-doubt, imposter syndrome, recognizing that sometimes people pleasing leads to toxic relationships. And so my job and role is to be their co-collaborator to help them understand that in order to move themselves forward.
I need to start by recognizing the 21-year-old daughter. So you apparently had her when you were 12-ish, I'm guessing.
Thank you for saying that. I do attribute and thank my mother and my father for some pretty awesome genes.
Well, yes, give them an extra thanks. And I do have a knack on this podcast for having people that have vampire tendencies. So quite often we have people on here that they say their age, and you don't have to say your age, but they say their age and we're like, no, that's not true. I need photographic evidence of that. So, girl, you are looking good.
Thank you. Thank you.
You hit a lot of buzzwords as you were
Mhm.
talking about what you do and what you help people with. And a lot of those buzzwords I definitely can relate to, and I know that our audience can as well. I would love to start with the good old self-sabotage.
Oh, yeah.
That seems super duper common, and
Mm.
I don't like to gender
Mhm.
specify here, but women, I feel like, are often way better at self-sabotaging. Why do we do that?
My take on it is it's a way that we can control the fallout. When we self-sabotage, it's a subconscious way that we deal with it, but it's a way that we get to control what we're really afraid of. And so through self-sabotage, even though we're hurting ourselves, we have this semblance of control over all that's going to happen on the other side of the self-sabotage. And you're right. I do think we're not going to, I think men and women self-sabotage. I know that I deal with it with all realms of the clients that I work with, but I do think that women in general have a strong tendency to just go into that self-sabotaging. I've seen it in relationships. I see it in the professional world. I see it as a parent. It's kind of a constant for many of us.
It's like you were reading my mind right then, because I was thinking, well, gosh, I feel like we do that in relationships. We do it in our professional world. How can we recognize it? And then what can we do, if anything, to reset that need to have that control? But within that control, really, we're hurting ourselves.
Really, what I think it comes down to is recognizing when fear has a handle on us. When there's a fear of failure, there's a fear of something going wrong, because usually that fear is indicative that we are going down the path of needing some type of control. And when we can recognize that, if you've listened to me in any realm, I say often awareness is the doorway to change. So once we're aware of that, now we can take action to change how we're showing up, or that what we're doing, what our that inner voice says, as well as the actions that we're taking in general.
So I think maybe a cousin to the self-sabotage is when we stay in a bad situation because it's comfortable. So
Mm.
those are really the times we should sabotage ourselves to get out of that situation. Why
Yeah.
do we do that? Is it also just that level of comfort and control?
I think it's two different things. One is it's the demon we know. And so when we're in a bad situation, it's we know that already, and we know how it moves through our day. We know how to manage it even though it feels really bad, we're still okay with it. The other is again another fear. It's the fear of failure. It's if I leave the bad situation, now I'm admitting that I couldn't make it work. I couldn't fix it. And so I think both of those play a part in why we would stay in a bad situation.
Do you see people that are kind of drowning in both of those behaviors at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, because I think, as humans, we're complex. So we've got many different things going on, and especially in situations, especially in relationships, we will see individuals stay because it's not just even the fear of failure. There are other fears that pop up, like for relationships where there are children involved. There's a fear of how are the children going to be affected. Is it going to be worse for them if I leave this relationship or if I stay in it? And truth be told, there's not a perfect answer. It's just gonna be your answer, and knowing, and that's when self-trust and that self-acceptance really comes into play, because it's knowing that whatever you choose to do, you're going to figure it out on the other side.
I would love it if you would chat for a minute about self-sabotage as a parent. So, I
Mhm.
am a pet parent, and I know that's a little different, but what are parents doing to self-sabotage, and how is that affecting their children?
I really think that parents get caught up in self-sabotage when they are still working through their own stories and narratives. So when they are projecting past experiences that they've had, and they are showing up with their children from that pretty disempowered place. And so what ends up happening is they are communicating to their children in a way that actually eventually hurts their children, or they are projecting their own desires onto their children of this is what you need to do with your life, or this is where you should go to school, or whatever the thing may be. And that's a form of self-sabotage, in the sense that again we're trying to control the outcome of how our child goes off into the world. And what we're failing to recognize is that our children don't actually belong to us. They're their own human, and it's about giving them space to become that human. And again, it's fear that either we're going to be looked at as a failing person or a failing parent, or there's fear around they're not going to live their best life, they're not going to be happy. And we forget the fact that each one of us has the autonomy to create happiness for ourselves.
Is there a sense of regret at all along with that, in that, I wanna project what I wish I would have done onto
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
because I couldn't do it or I didn't do it or whatever happened in my life that took me in a different direction?
100%. It's regret and it's grief. It's unprocessed grief. And I think a lot of parents that I end up working with do, once we get into it, we recognize, and they recognize, that it's just unprocessed grief around loss of time or loss of opportunity. And they need to go through that, and go through their own narratives and understand and work through that for themselves, because what they're doing is they're taking that grief and actually putting it onto their child, and having their child work out whatever it is that they need to work out. And that's really, the term that people use and throw around a lot is conscious parenting. And what that means is becoming conscious of what your own stories are, working through that on your own, and not putting that responsibility on your children to work out for you.
So you talked about grief, and I know a lot of us think of grief as I lost a person, I lost a pet, I lost something tangible in my life.
Mhm.
You're speaking about it as losing time and
Mhm.
opportunities. Will
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about that type of grief and how that can affect us so immensely as well?
Oh, yes. And I'm glad that we're talking about this because I don't think we talk about it enough. I think grief is usually, as you said, talked about it as though we've lost a person or a pet or something in our life. Especially in toxic relationships, I have seen individuals really grieve the loss of time or the loss of opportunity. Especially, let's just sort of take a toxic relationship where children are involved. Many individuals are grieving the loss of time that they feel they missed out on with their children while they were in a very toxic dynamic. And it is so important to recognize that you have to go through the same grieving process as though you were going through it losing a person because it's still time. There's anger involved, there's sadness involved. And we have to get to this place of acceptance and acknowledgement of that happened. And now I have to take that experience and what I have learned from it and move forward rather than continue to sit in it. Um, to that point too, loss of opportunity. Many people I just was talking to somebody yesterday about losing their job, and there's a sense of grief there too. You know, this individual had been in this career for several or 2 decades at least, a little more than that, and there was a layoff. And there's grief around that because there's grief around that opportunity and what that particular role meant to this individual. And again, we have to give ourselves permission to work through it because when we don't, we're actually suppressing those emotions. And when we suppress our emotions, we are keeping ourselves from being able to actually access what it is that we need and access our own growth process. It was funny. I was talking to my 13-year-old the other day because he's very into like, I'm too cool for emotions. And I'm like, yeah, no, you're not. You need to talk about your emotions. They're data packets. They're data packets that give you information on what you need or what's valuable to you. And when we don't grieve or we don't allow ourselves to grieve, we're actually suppressing our emotions and we have to give ourselves permission to feel the feelings.
How difficult is it for people who have stayed too long in a, let's say, a toxic situation or a traumatic
Mhm,
situation?
mhm,
Then they finally get out. Now they're experiencing that grief, not really necessarily of losing that toxic situation, but of losing the time and opportunity. How can they begin to reconcile those things together so that they can move forward?
it's so important to give yourself time, first of all. I think a lot of people leave those relationships or those situations and they think, okay, it's done. Now I need to just move on. And it's give yourself permission to actually heal. Give yourself permission to process through what it is that you just went through and give yourself the opportunity to, like I said, feel those emotions and also take time to recognize that there were lessons in it, even if in the moment it feels like, "Gosh, I should have done this or I should have done that." Stop in that moment, practice a little self-compassion, give yourself some kindness and say, "Okay, the situation is what it is. I cannot go undo the past. What did I learn, and how can I take that and move myself forward?" Because oftentimes I think we do one of 2 things. We either bolt, we're like, "Yep, I'm out. Let me just forget that it ever happened." Again, unprocessed, or we sit in it and it's we self-blame, and that doesn't get us anywhere either.
I love that you talked about taking a moment and looking at what have I learned. I feel like it's important to do that not only in those types of situations, but even if you've been through a traumatic event that truly was no fault of your own. But if you're still able to take a step back and see like what did I learn from it? Not that I could have done anything differently, but what can I take and move forward? How
Yeah.
do you feel about that thought process and what people can do if they've been through trauma that really wasn't their fault,
Mm.
they didn't bring it on themselves. What can they do to help themselves move forward from that as well?
You know, one thing that I wanna say on that topic, because I have heard this several times, is the idea of toxic positivity. And when we're saying take a moment to recognize what you've learned from a situation, we're not leaning into toxic positivity. We're not saying the thing didn't happen. Instead, we're acknowledging and recognizing this really traumatic event or situation occurred. There's no denying it. There's no pretending it didn't happen, saying, oh, that happened, and therefore it's totally fine because I believe XYZ. That's not what we're doing. I truly believe in slowing down and saying, okay, yes, that happened. That was awful. acknowledge it, and then ask yourself, how did I grow, or what was something I can take away from it? It's a form of a gratitude practice, actually, when we think about it. It's the what's the one right thing question, which I will routinely challenge people with, is like, I hear you, this is a really awful situation. What is the one right thing? Because sometimes just taking that one right thing allows us room to move forward. And that's how we rebuild resiliency. And when we've been through a traumatic event, that's what we're lacking in that moment, is our own personal resilience. So it's how can we start rebuilding that from the inside out? And I truly believe it has to be an inside out process, because if we're constantly focused on some external force or something to give us that, it it's almost like a shadow, or like it's pretend, because if that external force isn't there, we suddenly don't have the resilience again. So it's about how do we build it from the inside out.
Once again, I feel like you're in my head. As you were talking about that, it made me think about closure.
Mm,
So many of us are so focused on closure of a
mhm,
situation, but we are reliant on the other entity
mhm,
to get that
mhm,
closure.
mhm,
Oh, I just need so and so to apologize. I just
mhm,
need so and so to admit that they were wrong. And I feel like we're setting ourselves up for unhappiness, because if
mhm.
we're reliant on another individual for our own closure or peace, we're going to end up disappointed, most
Yep,
likely. How
yep.
do you help people recognize that, but then figure out how to move past that and get closure without relying on someone else?
On the other person.
Hmm.
Twofold, is my answer. One is radical acceptance, and what I mean by that is coming to a place of accepting what is. So it's not saying we condone their behavior or whatever it is that we perceive as the hurt upon us. We're just saying it is what it is. I acknowledge it's there, and I'm just allowing it to be there. And then it's a process of giving yourself permission to say what you need to say, but maybe not to them. So sometimes it's writing a letter that never gets sent, or sometimes it's talking it out loud in a voice memo. I do this with my clients all the time, which is, and they kind of look at me and they're like, Kamini, seriously? I'm like, yeah, you're going to write the letter, and then you're going to write it again. And then you're going to write it a third time. And then you know what you're going to do? You're going to rip it up and throw it away, because now you're done. Now you've processed through it. But it is this essence of, almost like that, it's almost like a soul to soul connection, and I don't mean to be woo woo, but it is, I'm getting to communicate what I need to communicate. The other person doesn't have to hear it. It's the process of you actually taking the steps to communicate what you need to. Because at the end of the day, you don't need their forgiveness or their apology. What you need is to allow yourself to no longer be anchored to it.
I love that. And I want to know how you feel that forgiveness plays into that, because there are a lot of different thought
Mm,
trains
mm,
on
mm.
forgiveness. Some
Yep.
people say, oh, you can't heal until you forgive the other person. I used to feel like that until I was in a situation where I could not
Hmm.
forgive
Hmm.
another individual for what happened. And so I felt like I was bogged down, weighted down. I couldn't move forward. And then it was actually on a podcast where the guest was saying, no, you don't have to forgive. And for me, I learned that I had to let the negativity go,
Yep.
but I didn't have to say, I forgive you, other person.
Yeah.
I would love to know how you feel about forgiveness and how it plays into closure and moving
Yeah.
forward.
It's funny, now you're in my head. I actually had a very similar thought process, and I do think it came from my upbringing, where it was like, you must forgive and forget. You have to forgive to let the other person to move forward. And I'm with you on this idea that it's not about forgiveness. It's about releasing the resentment, or releasing the attachment to the idea that they should show up a different way. And for me, it's also about self forgiveness, because when we really unpack it, usually there is a form of self blame that's occurring at the same time. So I believe in self forgiveness more than forgiveness of the other. And in terms of being able to move forward, when we have that self forgiveness and we're no longer shaming ourselves, that's actually when we can truly get to closure. Because in any relationship, there's two people, right? We both have a part. And if we're blaming, or we're waiting, or we feel like we have to forgive the other person, we're actually losing track of the fact that we have a part, and it's really forgiving ourselves in order for us to move forward.
I want to chat for a moment about imposter syndrome. Something else that you mentioned, something that I have definitely experienced. Some days I still feel like I do. I'm sitting there in my 9 to 5 job and I'm going, why again? How did I do this? Like, how did I fool them into thinking I was this amazing? Why do we get sucked into imposter syndrome so often?
I think it's a misfire in our minds and in our brains. We might be doing something that's slightly different or unique or we're not used to, and so our brain misfires and says, "Oh, I can't do this," or like, "Oh, how did they think that I even possibly could do this?" And really, what it is it's just something new. As I mentioned at the outset, my 19-year-old, he's in college. He's also a Division 1 lacrosse player right now. And he was sharing with me over this break was that a lot of his friends who were also all went off to play college lacrosse at different schools, a lot of them are dealing with that. And it's because now they're in this situation where there's so many great players. And so they're just like, oh, am I even really that good? So it's a lot of imposter syndrome. And it really is just a misfire of I'm in a new situation, I'm in a new environment, I'm with new teammates, and there's that uncomfortability of this is new, it's odd, it's awkward. I haven't done this before. I played high school lacrosse, but now I'm playing college lacrosse. So all of that gets turned into self-doubt and I don't know that I can do this, or maybe they didn't know the recruiter saw me and brought me here. And we all have it in different realms, but that's really what it is. It's our brain telling us that there's something wrong with us or we can't trust ourselves. And really what we have to recognize is it's just might be new, it might be slightly different. And we've done different before. We've done new before. We've done it since we were babies. It's just giving ourselves permission to go back into that self-trust.
When we are experiencing those feelings of doubt, can that manifest onto the people surrounding us? Can it change their perception of us and our abilities at all?
Oh, 100%, because truth be told, we're affected by our environment and we also affect our environment, right? And the people around us. So if we're self-doubting, we're going to be in a negative thought space. So even as we're showing up with that negative energy. Most probably we're going to be showing up from that disempowered place. And now we're interacting with people from a disempowered place. So they're going to start to feel not so great, and there might be conflict that we find in between individuals. I'm just sort of thinking through even some of the dancers that I've worked with. A lot of times they'll say, like, I don't know what's going on, but everybody in the company seems so upset and so frustrated. And it is because one person or two people might be really suffering from either self-doubt or just some type of negativity. They bring it into the company atmosphere, and now suddenly everybody's in this terrible mental headspace about can they do this production or not. So it really does breed. It like bleeds out into into the ethers.
I know we weren't going to get woo woo, but in on that note, just a little bit of woo. That negative energy, I so agree with you that it feels like that one negative energy or negative vibe can really affect the whole group. How can
Mhm.
we really be conscious of that and work to change that? Because if the negative can do it, the positive could do it as well.
Totally. And I'll give you something that I tell people. It's very tangible, which is the moment we have a negative thought, you got to think of at least three positive things that are happening. And again, not toxic positivity. It's like the three right things. So, yep, you had a negative thought. We're not going to beat ourselves up for that, but instead, it's give it at least let's come up with three things that are going well or okay at the same time.
Love it. So we do sometimes give homework on this podcast. So this is your homework, audience, is when you get those negative thoughts, you got to do the three positives.
Yes, I love it.
And we want to hear about them. We want to hear about them. So you have mentioned a couple times toxic positivity, and
Mhm.
that may be a term that some people aren't familiar with. Will you talk a little bit about that, where it came from, and how we can avoid it?
Yeah, so I believe that it came from this idea that affirmations and affirmations do work, but I think that what ends up happening is a lot of people think that all they have to do is say an affirmation, and they want to almost cover up or run away from the thing that they're trying to work through. And so toxic positivity leans into this idea that if we're having like a negative thought, we'll just simply say the opposite. Well, our brains aren't going to believe it in the moment maybe, but it's going to come back up because we're not actually dealing with the thing. So when I talk about shifting the thought, it's very important that we're not running away from whatever it is that we notice it, we name the thought, and then we ask ourselves, and what else is true? Or we ask ourselves, what's of value or meaning to me? Now we're making room for this other piece, but we're not pushing that away. Toxic positivity would almost say, like, that doesn't exist. Let's pretend it's not there. And let's only think about the positive. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about toxic positivity. And the reason, again, why I don't believe that toxic positivity is helpful is because in the moment it helps, but it's how do we get underneath it and how do we clear out what's there rather than just putting a band-aid on it.
I feel like we do that pretty often where we just want to band-aid things.
Yeah.
And when we're in a group setting or with our friends and we see them doing that, we want to jump in and we want to
Mhm.
try to help them or save them for maybe some of our own personal reasons.
Right.
What are good ways, positive ways that we can support our friends or family when they're experiencing whether it's imposter syndrome or self sabotage or toxic positivity? What
Yep.
are things we can do so that they don't want to punch us, but we are actually being helpful and supportive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really comes down to a couple things. One is acknowledging what it is that they're going through and feeling rather than going right into, let me fix it for you. It's, I hear you, or that must be hard. There's nothing wrong with saying to somebody, like, that is terrible. And I feel you, like, I feel for you and I feel you. And sometimes it's also just ask them to tell me more. I do think that a lot of us do jump in to try to fix it or give them the solution. And it's really important to just let them be able to be and give them time to process through what it is that's coming up for them rather than giving them a solution because that's more like a band aid in the moment.
How, as the individual who is experiencing these things, how can they maybe be more open or more receptive or even help their friend help them in that moment? What can that person do to facilitate maybe the relationship and the help that the person is trying to give them, or to
Mm.
stand up for themselves kindly, to say what they need?
I think when we're in it and we're the person going through it, sometimes it can be really difficult because we are so enmeshed in what's happening. And so that for the individual going through it, it's so important to get really present in this moment. I talk about mindfulness all the time because a lot of times when we're going through it, we are either ruminating about something that happened or we are fearing the future, right? So it's for that person, the very first thing is to be in this moment, grounded here and now. And then it is to really presence yourself to ask yourself, what is it that I do need? Clearly, I'm going through an emotion. Name the emotion and then say, okay, so what's that emotion telling me I need? And from there, we can communicate to the person who's there to support us, like, okay, really, honestly, this is what I need, and recognize that maybe that person can't give us what we need, but even just voicing it is that first step, because if we're voicing it and that person's like, oh, I'm so sorry, I can't give that to you, then we can say, okay, either I self-source it or we go find somebody else to help us. But the very first step is to understand what it is that we actually need, because a lot of times when we're in it, we're circling in whatever that emotion is, and we're like I said, thinking about the past or worrying about the future so much so that we're coming from a very disempowered place. So when we can actually ground ourselves first, then we can take those steps to move forward.
So, perfectionism is another big one that I
Mhm.
think flows into this so well.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, if one of us have done it, all of us have done it where we have said in a job interview or on an application, "Oh, I'm a perfectionist, and it's so great because that means I get everything done
Mhm.
correctly." Talk about perfectionism and why it's not such a good thing.
So perfectionism, I think, is more of a limiting belief because it's the belief that we can do things perfectly or there's a right way to do it. And so what ends up happening is this actually leads into self-sabotage a lot too, because if we fear that we can't do it perfectly, we might actually not engage in the thing that we're trying to do and self-sabotage and completely disengage from whatever it is. Also, perfectionism can hurt us in relationships when we have these really high standards and we expect others to live up to them. I know that a lot of my clients that I've worked with as parents will expect their children to be perfect individuals, perfect young humans, and they are young humans. So they're not going to be perfect. They're going to make mistakes. But really, truly, as a recovering perfectionist, I say that because there are moments where I still get caught up in it. It's the fear of failure. It is also the fear of making a mistake. And the challenge really is to recognize that mistakes are really just outcomes we don't like. That's all they are. They're just outcomes we didn't anticipate or that we don't like. And if we can look at it that way, it gives us the room to say, and how did I grow? Or what did I learn? And how can I take that information and move forward? Because when we sit in that perfectionism, what ends up happening is either paralysis or, like I mentioned before, disengagement. We just don't actually engage in the thing. And so we stay really stuck in our comfort zone, but everything outside of that zone and that growth zone gets completely ignored. And we don't actually give ourselves permission to grow.
So perfectionism, bad.
There are moments when it can be good. There are moments I do joke, I'm like, there are moments where it can be good, like, when maybe you're titrating medication, I don't wanna be perfect about that, right? Like, it's like, "Oh, I don't wanna overdose on my medication."
So for pharmacists, we want you to be spot on. We need you to have that perfectionism while you're at work. That's what we need.
Surgeons too, maybe,
Yeah,
maybe they do that
yes.
perfectly.
We have talked a lot about self. So
Mm.
self-sabotage, self-care, self-love. Why is it so hard for us so often to focus on ourselves and instead, we try to fix other people, we try to look at what other people are doing. Why is it so hard for us to really focus on ourselves? Because that's the only one we can really change.
Yeah. I think, sometimes we take on the narrative that it's selfish to think of to focus on ourselves. I've heard that many times. It's like, "Well, isn't that selfish to worry about what my needs are?" And my answer to that is, if you don't know what your needs are, how can you actually authentically be in that relationship with that other person? So it's actually a self-full practice. Is it selfish to take time for yourself to, maybe meditate or go for a walk or exercise or do whatever it is that fills your cup back up? Well, again, it's a self-full practice because if we don't do that, we're running on burnout. And how can we show up fully for the people in our lives? Because that's truly, we want to fix them or we want to help them or we want to take care of them. How do we do that if we're not fully there? But I do think that a lot of it comes from past narratives and past beliefs about the fact that either it's selfish or people are sometimes scared to look at themselves because if they look at themselves, they actually have to face some of these truths.
We should have a mic drop right there. You have a program or a system called Authentic Me.
Mhm.
How did you come to create that, and what is your favorite part about it and what it does for people?
So I created it through my own growth process because, as I mentioned, I've been a people pleaser and a perfectionist my whole life. I'm also a high achiever, and so there are those things had started to hold me back because I was defining myself by the roles that I was playing rather than me as a person. Also, professionally, I had been really spending a lot of time helping people figure out what it is that they really wanted. Just not just professionally, but personally as well. So I kind of brought those two worlds together and realized that if we could, through my coaching practice, if I could create a space where my clients are really working on realigning with their values, their core beliefs, their needs, and really come home to that authentic me. From there, they can actually set the goals in place of where they want to go professionally or personally. So for me, it was really an act of how do we start naming this fact that we have covered ourselves up with almost like this layer of dust from the time that we were little babies into these adults that we are, where we don't actually even know ourselves. And so, if we give ourselves permission to actually re realign, reimagine, just get back to that place of who we are as individuals and recognize that that uniqueness is our gift, from that place, anything is possible.
What is one simple thing that people can do to start removing that layer of dust off of themselves, to start finding their authentic and true selves that maybe they have lost along the way for many, many years?
Really believe that ground zero for us are our values, our core values. I think oftentimes we lose track of our own values because either we're influenced by family, society, culture, tradition, whatever it may be. So taking some time to get back in alignment with what your core values are is the very first step towards moving into that place.
What other piece of advice would you give, if anything? It might just be start with your core values. But if you wanted to help somebody or look at somebody who is just in the trenches with the self-doubt, with the self-sabotage, with a bad relationship, what would you tell them to do other than to come see you, or before you tell them to come see you and anything is possible?
I love it. Yes, come see me. Core values. And then I also really, two other things, self compassion and mindfulness. Self compassion is really slowing down and being kind to yourself over judgment. I think when we're in those trenches, it is so easy to fall into judgment, and that gets us nowhere. So it's about being kind, giving yourself permission to ask what have I learned? How have I grown? What information can I take to move forward? And then it really is about mindfulness. It's about being in this present moment. We cannot go and undo the past. And so often we are ruminating over choices we've made in the past. The honest truth about it all is that we made choices based on whatever information we had at the time. And here we are in present day trying to judge our younger self for something. And that's truly quite unfair when we think about it, because that younger self didn't have that information. And so what we end up doing is wasting time and energy trying to judge that younger self. And instead it's, okay, I'm here, I'm in this moment. So now what do I choose to do? And again, if we align back to our values, we can take that aligned action that's actually meaningful to us.
How easy is it for people when they're judging their younger selves? It seems like sometimes people fall into playing the victim or being the
Mm,
victim, and they are perpetuating that by blaming everybody else while they're just sitting in their sorrow.
mhm.
How can people recognize that and move past it?
You're absolutely right. I think, and I'll tell people when they reach out for coaching, if you're stuck in victimhood, you're not quite ready for coaching, because coaching is, and just in general, in order to move past it, we have to get to this place of knowing that we had a part, not again, not blame, but we had a part in whatever. If we're stuck in this all happened to me, we're not open to giving ourselves permission to learn and to grow from whatever we just experienced. And so when we're in that victimhood, it's recognizing that even the dialogue of like, oh my gosh, this happened to me, oh, they did this to me. And when we're in that, it's noticing it and then shifting it into, okay, I this was terrible, I don't, not enjoying where I am, but how could it possibly have been for me, or how can this help me grow, or how can this be something that almost is happening like through me, right? Especially when we're coming out of toxic relationships. It's like, okay, that was really awful. How did this happen for me? Or what was it? How am I growing through this process?
So we're going back to kind of that learning aspect of it. What can I take from this that I
Mhm.
can carry with me for better?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, we are consistently evolving and growing. And if we're open to that, then we can actually continue to move forward. If we're closed off from it, then we do stay in victimhood.
We are going to take a quick turn before I let you go, and we are going to chat about tattoos. Now, I know that you don't have any tattoos, but
Yep.
interestingly enough, you shared earlier that one of your intake questions is
Mhm.
you ask people if they were going to get a tattoo, what would it be and why? So I'm going to flip that on you and ask you, if you were going to get a tattoo, what would it be, why, and where would you put
Oh, I didn't know that part was coming at me.
it?
It would be my children's birth dates. It would either be on my wrist or my ankle, and the why is because honestly, they are my why. I believe that they are here. Hopefully, they'll be there. I mean, well, they're going to be their own person, but they can take the best parts of me and maybe use them to help them grow and move forward. So yeah, that would be my tattoo.
Now, without breaking any rules or confidentiality, can you tell us the weirdest answer that you have ever gotten on the intake form?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one because honestly, most of them are really they're really thoughtful and they mean something to the person. So I don't know that they're weird. Um, I do get a lot of I would never get a tattoo, like almost like offended by the question. And I'm like, I wasn't trying to offend you. um, I don't know off the top of my head weird ones. They were all pretty um they're all like really meaningful things, like a lot of dates, symbols that mean something to the individual. I just find it super cool how people will interpret that question. I even find it interesting when people get offended because I, of course,
Mhm.
being me, am like, tell me about that.
Right, there's something deeper there.
What about that offended you? Where does that come from? But no, I can't come up with anything weird, but I can say that the numbers and the dates have been pretty cool to me. And maybe it's because it resonates with me because
Mhm.
mine would be dates. So
I love that. Kamini, where can people find you? So, if they want to talk to you about authentic me, if they want to figure out how they can move past a toxic relationship or heal from some past trauma, or if they want to share with you that their 13-year-old also will not recognize feelings, where can they find you?
they can find me at kaminiwood.com or on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest with the handle It's Authentic Me.
Kamini, you have been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. I know that the audience is truly going to get so much out of our conversation, so I appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you. This conversation was amazing. So thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media so you'll never miss what's going on. Remember, until next week, you are strong enough, you are worth it. Thank you for listening to the Strong Enough podcast. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform by searching Strong Enough. And on YouTube, we're on the Spear Talk channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Strong Enough Pod. If you have suggestions for an upcoming episode or a future guest, please reach out at strongenoughpod@gmail.com. Remember, you are worth it.